Over the course of this podcast series, you'll hear myself and my guests talking about asking listeners to support you and thanking them when they do. In real time, it is the last week of January, and I want to start by thanking the late bloomer actor for all those lovely streamed sats on Fountain. We haven't covered streaming or sats in the podcast yet, but we soon will. The episodes releasing this week are on the funding tag, so it is an apt time for me to thank Eileen Smith for being the first listener to buy me a coffee, saying, "Love how you are spreading the word about podcasting 2.0. Thanks, Claire." Well, thank you too, Eileen. You can buy me a coffee by visiting buymeacoffee.com/creativityfound or simply clicking the funding icon in your modern podcast app. I'll show you what this looks like in the funding homework episode. And on True Fans, the show has been supported by Martin Linskog from the podcast Studio Fusion. I hope Deborah feels better soon. And the aim is to make things easier for the podcaster at all times. So defo through the hosting provider. And when it happens, rest assured I'll release an episode to let you know. Martin will know what I mean. And you will too if you read his comments on the chapters and super chapters episodes on True Fans. Okay, on with the show.
It's all about interactivity with the listener and making it a lot easier for the listener to get more involved with your podcast, whatever that looks like for listening, comments, or funding. And it could be $1, it could be $5, it could be $1,000, whatever that looks like. That would be awesome if it was $1,000. But yeah, whatever that looks like. And it ties back to the value for value model. If they get value from your podcast and they want to support, the funding makes it super easy no matter what option they prefer.
Welcome back to Podcasting 2.0 in practice. One of the first things that attracted me to what Podcasting 2.0 has to offer was the chance to earn some money. A little financial support or a value for value, which you'll know all about, listener, from my episode with David and Leela Midas. I've asked Danny Brown to explain what the funding feature is and why it's so cool. Hi, Danny. How are you?
I'm good, Claire. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Start by introducing yourself and your podcasting background.
Yep, sure. So my name's Danny Brown, and not to be mistaken with the Detroit rapper Danny Brown, very different people. I've been podcasting officially for just under 10 years. My first podcast was 2016, so about 8-9 years now. If you count it unofficially, then 2009 when I did one solitary episode over at Blog Talk Radio, which was fun, but I didn't do any more after that. So yeah, about 2016. I'm also the head of podcaster support and experience at Captivate.fm. We position ourselves as the growth platform for the serious indie podcaster.
I love that, the serious indie podcaster. So tell me, please, what the funding tag is. We call them tags. You know, listener, they're features. We'll get to the technical terms of tags later in this series. Those words are interchangeable. So what is the funding tag and how does it work?
Yeah, so as the name suggests, it's a way for listeners or followers to fund your podcast and your ongoing podcasting journey. And there's lots of ways you can do that. You mentioned value for value. And obviously, David and Leela talked about the many ways of value for value. And funding, as I mentioned, it's a way to make it really simple for listeners to support your podcast, whether that's through value for value, Patreon, or any kind of monetization options you have that make it easy for podcast listeners and followers to support your show.
So this is something that as a podcaster, and I'm going to explain as a listener why it's good for a listener as well, but as a podcaster, you're going to need to see whether your hosting company supports that. And then you can set it up within your hosting company. Is that correct?
It is. You can do it on your own as well. But primarily, it's a lot easier if your hosting company does support it. And I think most of the hosts now do actually support. Podcasting 2.0 tags have really got a lift in the last 6 to 12 months by a lot of podcast hosting companies, which is great to see. So yeah, if your hosting company supports it, it makes it super easy because then you can use the funding tag directly within your podcast RSS feed. Then makes it super easy for podcasting apps that support the funding tag to allow listeners to support you on their favorite podcast app. So yeah, hosting company is super easy. If not, you could essentially create your own link somewhere and use that. But it's a bit more technical. And, if you don't want to do the hard work and have to maintain it and everything like that and use your own server, which I know David Medius talks about a lot of the times, how he had to build his own server, etc. If you don't want to do that, then yeah, look for a hosting company. There's plenty of them out there that support fund and tag.
Yeah. And I think what that means is the ease for the listener. This is what we want. We want to put fewer and fewer barriers between the listener and the podcaster so that it's easy to do. So you mentioned there Patreon. We've talked with Sarah Ferris about some of the more, I do air quotes, traditional monetization, sponsorship, adverts, Patreon, buy me a coffee, which you can still do with all of these other Podcasting 2.0 features. But what do you think is the advantage of the funding tag being there where you can see it?
Yeah, and the main thing is, Patreon obviously is very well known by podcasters and a lot of listeners now. When it first came out, it's a new technology that you have to get used to. But I feel now when you talked about supporting your favourite podcaster, a lot of people do default to Patreon because it's well known. But the good thing with the funding option is for people that don't know about Patreon or there's still a lot of people that don't have credit cards, for example, so they can't, support via Patreon because you have to pay via credit card, via Stripe, etc. So for any payment options where you can't support because you don't have a credit card for whatever reason, or you have a Visa debit that doesn't support online transactions through Stripe, then having a funding option allows you to basically create multiple areas where listeners can support you based on their preference. So it might be a Patreon, it might be a Buy Me a Coffee, it could be your PayPal.me link, and it could just be, like you say, a really simple way to support financially, no matter what option the listeners prefer. So again, you'd mentioned earlier the tags and the features of Podcasting 2.0. It's all about interactivity with the listener and making it a lot easier for the listener to get more involved with your podcast, whatever that looks like for listening, comments, or funding.
Yeah, we talked at the very beginning, we introduced those concepts of the problems we have as podcasters with discoverability and interactivity being one of them. Now, I've set up my funding for my show Creativity Found with my host who isn't Captivate. So when you're talking, Danny, about having other places to go, with Captivate, you support funding. Is that something that the podcast can set up and choose where the money goes? Yeah,
so the way that hosting companies work, and certainly Captivate, so I'll speak to Captivate because that's where I am, and some different hosting companies might have slightly different ways of doing it. But at Captivate, you've got multiple options for monetization, which ties into the funding, tag. So we have memberships and tips. So if that's your supporter link, you can use that as your funding link. If you use Patreon, you can drop that into the Patreon. There's like a little donation URL within the podcast settings that you can drop a link in. So that could be Patreon, it could be PayPal, it could be Buy Me a Coffee, whatever external third-party payment option you use, you would drop that in to your donation link, and that becomes your funding link. There's also, under the podcast settings, a tag area for funding. So again, you can either leave that blank, and if you use Captivate's monetization features, we will default that link to that monetization option. So if it's your memberships where people, very similar to Patreon, if people pay your monthly fee, that will be your default funding link. If you don't have that activated, but you have tips activated, which is kind of like Buy Me a Coffee, then that will become your default funding link. So it's all done at hosting level. And whatever you add as donation links or monetization links on top of what Captivate makes as a default one, that's the options that people can support with when using the funding tag on podcasting apps.
Brilliant. Got it. So this one, you can just give some money. So the podcaster doesn't have to say, I've given you extra content, I'm giving you ad-free content or whatever it is. It could just be the listener can go, I like this show, I want them to keep going, I'll give them $3 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And it could be $1, it could be $5, it could be $1,000. Whatever that looks like. That would be awesome if it was $1,000. But yeah, whatever that looks like. And it ties back to the value for value model. If they get value from your podcast and they want to support, the funding makes it super easy, no matter what option they prefer, that they can then buy you a coffee or send you some money via PayPal or, direct to Stripe, etc. And the cool thing is, If you didn't want to just sort of limit that to one option and you want to make it super easy for your listeners to support you, and Dave is a great example of this actually. He has a V4V page on his website, and that shows you all the different ways you can support the podcast. So you can do, memberships, you can do Patreon, you can do PayPal, you can send a check, you can do X, Y, Z. So you could actually make that your funding link. And then when someone does press the funding on their podcast app, it goes to that page, and then they can choose exactly how they want to do things that way.
Brilliant. So it's super easy for the listener. They're there, they're in the app, they're listening to the show, and they click on the funding symbol, whatever it is, because they're all a little bit different. And I'll talk about that in future episodes. Then they have their choices. So they don't have to think about it and then remember later I was going to do that. They can do it right there where they're listening. So my only other question, Danny, is whether you have any thoughts or comments or ideas for how podcasters should communicate that their listeners can do this, because it's all very well there being a symbol on an app, but if your listener doesn't know what that means or that you're even looking out for some support. So what are your thoughts on or ideas on that, really?
Yeah, and that's a great point. That's where the funding tag does need more adoption. And same with many podcasting 2.0 tags that don't have as much adoption as, say, transcripts or chapters, for example. So yeah, it does need more adoption, and it'd be great if there was one unifying symbol for funding. And it might just be dollars, it might be a little dollar sign. That's the US dollar is still the global currency, basically. So that might be the way to make it clearer. But yeah, as a podcaster, have a call to action both in your show notes and as an audio snippet. So if your hosting company supports dynamic inserts, record a little audio snippet that tells your listeners, hey, if you enjoy the show and you want to support it in any way, you can do that by clicking a little funding symbol on your podcast app, which might be $1, it might be a little square. Check your analytics and see what podcast apps your listeners are using the most, and then see what their funding symbol is, and then use that language in the audio call to action. So you're making a little note, a little blurb in your show notes. If you enjoy the show and you want to support it, here's how you can do that. And that's a link to the funding link. Same on your audio snippet. Just say you can do that by going to podcastname.com/support, whatever that looks like. Make it super easy. Make it repetitive so people start to get into the mindset, I could actually support the show. I really enjoyed the episode. I'm going to chuck a couple of bucks Danny or Claire's way. And just tell people about it online as well. It's like anything. The more you tell people about something, the more likely they are to remember it and then act upon it when they want to actually, support you, because you've just shared some really cool advice or had an awesome guest on it they really enjoyed having.
Brilliant. Thank you. It's a learning for all of us, podcaster and listener, that this can be done, and this would be very useful and helpful. Thank you so much, Danny. It's been really lovely to talk to you. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed it too. Thank you, Claire.
Visit creativityfound.co.uk/podcasting to find out more about my guests and access lots of useful podcast resources. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send a boost. But if you haven't got to that lesson yet, feel free to reach out to me on my Instagram account at podcasting 2.0 in practice. Are you thinking of starting your own podcast and looking for a little advice from someone who started from scratch and hasn't looked back? That's me, by the way. Then book a podcast startup sanity check with me so we can work together to clarify and simplify the process of starting a show. I have been podcasting with Creativity Found for 4 years. I have won and been shortlisted for prestigious podcast awards, been a guest on other people's shows, and attended many podcast-specific events in the UK and US, where I have made lots of podcasty pals across all genres. For my second show, Podcasting 2.0 in Practice, I have had the privilege of talking to industry experts, as together we teach creators how to benefit from and implement the latest Podcasting 2.0 technologies. In this paid 4 hours chat, we can talk through your content idea, how to record, which platforms are worth the money, how to get your show to all the listening apps, what you need to know to future-proof your show, and much more. Please note, I will not tell you how to have a chart-topping show in your first week, nor how to pitch to sponsors. I will, however, act as a mentor whom you can run your ideas and questions past. The decisions you make with the knowledge you gain are all your own. Visit creativityfound.co.uk/podcasting to find out more. And there is, of course, a link in the show notes.